I stood in my kitchen in Scottsdale, carefully arranging homemade cookies on my grandmother's best china plate, telling myself this family meeting might finally bring us together. My sister Patricia had called 3 days earlier, with warmth I hadn't heard in her voice since before grandmother's funeral 6 months ago. "Sarah, we need to talk," she'd said, her tone gentle but urgent. "The family's been fractured long enough. Come to the house Sunday evening, just us." For the first time in months, I felt a flutter of hope that maybe we could heal the wounds that had split our family apart since grandmother's will reading. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun was setting over Paradise Valley as I drove toward the family estate, the cookies still warm in their container beside me. My grandmother had left me a substantial portion of her real estate empire, and I knew it had created tension with Patricia and our Aunt Margaret. But I genuinely believed we could work through it as a family. The adobe mansion looked exactly as it had during countless holiday gatherings, its warm light spilling across the desert landscape, making everything feel familiar and safe. I pulled into the circular driveway, noting Patricia's Mercedes and Margaret's Lexus already parked near the front entrance. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the cookies and walked toward the heavy wooden door, my heels clicking against the flagstone pathway. This was my family. These were people who had celebrated my birthdays, comforted me through breakups, and cheered at my college graduation. Whatever problems we had, surely we could solve them together. Patricia opened the door before I could knock, her smile bright and welcoming. She wore a cream-colored sweater that made her look softer somehow, more like the sister I remembered from childhood. "Sarah, you made it," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt genuine. "And you brought grandmother's snickerdoodles. She would have loved that." The familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the desert evening air, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Margaret emerged from the living room, her silver hair perfectly styled as always, arms extended for an embrace. "Darling, it's been too long," she murmured against my cheek. "We've all been so foolish, letting grief tear us apart when we should be supporting each other." Her husband Thomas appeared behind her, offering his characteristic gentle smile and a firm handshake. The scene felt like a restoration, like we were finally returning to who we used to be. We settled into the living room where grandmother's portrait still hung above the fireplace, her kind eyes seeming to watch over our gathering. Patricia poured wine from a bottle I recognized as one of grandmother's favorites, and for nearly an hour, we talked about everything except the inheritance. We reminisced about family vacations, shared updates about our lives, and laughed at old inside jokes. The tension that had plagued our family for months seemed to dissolve with each shared memory. Then, my phone buzzed against the coffee table. The screen lit up with Jake Morrison's name, my attorney, and 3 words that made my blood freeze. "Call me immediately." No greeting, no context, just those 3 urgent words glowing on the screen. My stomach dropped as conversations around me continued, but the sound became muffled, distant, as if I were hearing it underwater. I excused myself to the bathroom, my hands already trembling as I dialed Jake's number. He answered before the first ring finished. "Sarah, where are you right now?" His voice was sharp, professional, stripped of its usual warmth. "I need you to listen carefully and don't react visibly to what I'm about to tell you. Your family filed a lawsuit this morning. They're claiming you exerted undue influence over your grandmother and that the will should be invalidated." The bathroom mirror reflected my face, pale and shocked, as Jake's words continued to flow through the phone. "They've hired Collins and Associates, one of the most aggressive probate firms in Phoenix. Sarah, this isn't just about the money. They're claiming you isolated your grandmother, manipulated her medication schedules, and coerced her into changing her will while she was mentally compromised. They want everything, and they're not playing around." I gripped the marble countertop, struggling to process what I was hearing. "Jake, that's insane. You know how much I loved grandmother. I visited her every week, helped with her medications because she asked me to, drove her to doctor appointments when no one else could. How can they twist that into something sinister?" But even as I spoke, I understood. Every act of love and care I had shown could be reframed as calculation, every moment of closeness reinterpreted as manipulation. They have witnesses, Sarah. Home care workers who say you were overly controlling about visitors. Neighbors who claim you limited family access. They're painting a picture of systematic isolation and influence. Jake's voice softened slightly. I need you to get out of there. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and definitely don't discuss the case. Can you leave without raising suspicion? I stared at myself in the mirror, seeing not the beloved granddaughter who had cherished every moment with the family matriarch, but a target, a mark who had walked willingly into what was clearly a setup. The cookies I had baked with such hope now felt like evidence of my naivete. Jake, they invited me here tonight. They said they wanted to heal the family. The words came out hollow, the reality of the situation finally settling into my bones. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. That invitation wasn't about healing anything. They wanted to see how you'd react. Maybe get you to say something they could use against you. You need to leave now. The urgency in his voice cut through my shock, and I realized that every warm smile, every gentle embrace, every shared memory from tonight had been performance. They had been studying me, cataloging my responses, looking for weaknesses to exploit. I ended the call and stood in the bathroom for several long minutes, trying to compose myself. When I finally returned to the living room, the scene looked exactly the same. Patricia was refilling wine glasses, Margaret was showing Thomas something on her phone, and the fire crackled cheerfully in the fireplace. But now I could see the careful staging in their relaxed postures, the practiced quality of their laughter, and the way their eyes tracked my movement when they thought I wasn't looking. "Everything all right, dear?" Margaret asked, her voice layered with what I now recognized as false concern. Patricia turned from the wine cabinet, her expression mimicking worry, but I caught something else in her eyes.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Calculation. Assessment. They were waiting to see how much I knew, how I would react, whether their trap had been discovered. Just a work call, I managed, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass in my mouth. You know how clients can be. The lie came easier than I expected, and I was grateful for the years of maintaining professional composure in difficult situations. I sat back down, accepting the wine Patricia offered, and continued the charade for another 20 minutes, all while my mind raced through the implications of what Jake had told me. Every memory they had shared tonight took on a different meaning now. When Margaret mentioned how devoted I had been to grandmother, she wasn't celebrating my love. She was gathering ammunition for her narrative of manipulation. When Thomas commented on how much time I had spent at the estate, he wasn't acknowledging my dedication. He was building a case for undue influence. Even Patricia's warm greeting now felt like a predator sizing up prey. I excused myself as soon as I could without appearing rude, claiming an early morning meeting. The hugs goodbye felt like betrayals, their warm words like poison in my ears. As I walked to my car, I could feel their eyes on me through the living room windows, and I wondered what they were saying now that their performance was over. Were they congratulating themselves on how well they had played their parts? Were they already planning their next move in this chess game I hadn't realized I was playing? The drive home through the desert darkness felt surreal. The familiar streets of Scottsdale looked the same, but everything had changed. My phone sat silent in the passenger seat, but Jake's words echoed in my head. Undue influence, manipulation, systematic isolation. They were taking every act of love and twisting it into evidence of wrongdoing. The woman who had driven her grandmother to chemotherapy appointments was now painted as controlling. The granddaughter who had organized medication schedules was now portrayed as someone who manipulated an elderly woman's mental state. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the full scope of my situation was becoming clear. This wasn't just about money, though the inheritance was substantial. This was about family members who had decided that their financial comfort was more important than truth, more valuable than the bonds we had shared for decades. They were willing to destroy my reputation, drag our family's private pain into public court proceedings, and rewrite our shared history to get what they wanted. David's car was in the garage when I got home, and I felt a wave of relief knowing I wouldn't have to face this alone. He worked long hours as an IT consultant, often traveling for clients, but tonight I needed his steady presence more than ever. I found him in his home office, laptop open, focused intently on his screen in the way he always was when working on complex projects. The familiar sight of him in his reading glasses, completely absorbed in his work, provided the first moment of genuine comfort I had felt since leaving the estate. "How was the family dinner?" he asked, glancing up with the warm smile that had first attracted me to him 5 years ago. But when he saw my face, his expression immediately shifted to concern. He closed the laptop and turned his full attention to me, something I had always loved about David. When you needed him, he was completely present, giving you his undivided focus. I sank into the chair across from his desk and told him everything. About the lawsuit, the allegations, the realization that tonight's dinner had been an elaborate setup designed to study my reactions and potentially gather more evidence against me. David listened without interruption, his jaw tightening as I described the accusations of manipulation and undue influence. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing what I had told him. "Sarah, you know none of that is true," he said, finally, his voice steady and certain. "I watched you with your grandmother. I drove you to the hospital when she had her stroke, sat with you in waiting rooms during her treatments, saw how you cried when she died. No one who witnessed your relationship could believe you were anything but a devoted granddaughter." His certainty was balm to my wounded heart, but I knew that truth and legal reality didn't always align. "But they have witnesses, David. People who will testify that I was controlling, that I limited access to grandmother. How do I fight that?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I was asking him to solve a problem that might be unsolvable. How do you prove love when someone is determined to paint it as manipulation? How do you defend devotion when it's being reframed as calculation? David stood up and moved to the window, looking out at our quiet suburban street. "We'll figure this out," he said, but I could hear the weight in his voice. This wasn't a technical problem he could solve with code or algorithms. This was human nature at its worst, family bonds being weaponized for financial gain. David Morrison is a good lawyer. He'll know how to handle this. But even as he spoke, I could see the concern in his reflection in the dark window. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind churning through every interaction I had had with my grandmother in her final years. Had I been too involved in her care? Had my concern for her well-being somehow crossed a line into control? I remembered the afternoon she asked me to help her organize her medications because she was getting confused about dosing schedules. At the time, it had seemed like a simple request from someone I loved. Now I wondered if that moment would be twisted into evidence of manipulation. I thought about the times I had diplomatically suggested that maybe she was getting too many visitors on days when she was feeling weak, or when I had quietly asked family members to call before coming over because surprise visits sometimes overwhelmed her. At the time, everyone had seemed grateful for my coordination. Now I realized those same actions could be presented as evidence that I was isolating her from family. The accusations felt like a fundamental rewriting of reality, and that was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire situation. The same actions that had been praised as caring and responsible were now characterized as manipulative and controlling. The same family members who had thanked me for managing grandmother's care were now claiming I had overstepped my bounds. It was as if our shared history was being erased and replaced with a new narrative that served their financial interests. As dawn broke over the desert, I realized that the family I thought I knew had never really existed, or had ceased to exist the moment money became more important than truth. The people who hugged me goodbye tonight weren't the same people who had raised me,
Supported me and loved me through the years. They had made a choice to prioritize their inheritance over their integrity, and that choice had transformed them into strangers wearing familiar faces. The sun rose over Scottsdale, painting the desert mountains in shades of gold and pink, but the beauty of the morning felt distant and irrelevant. Today would be the first day of what I was beginning to understand would be a long and brutal battle, not just for my grandmother's estate, but for the truth itself. My family had declared war on my character, my motives, and my right to grieve and honor the woman who had meant everything to me. I finally understood that this was no longer about inheritance or family dynamics. This was about survival, and the question of whether truth could triumph over a well-constructed lie backed by expensive lawyers and false witnesses. The cookies I had baked with such hope still sat on the kitchen counter, untouched and accusatory, a reminder of how completely I had misread the situation and how much I still had to learn about the people I thought I knew best. Part 2. The Documentation Review. Jake Morrison's office sat on the 15th floor of a gleaming tower in downtown Phoenix, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the sprawling desert city below. The sun rose harsh shadows across the conference table, where he had spread out what looked like half a forest worth of legal documents. Each page represented another piece of the web my family had been weaving around me, and the sheer volume was overwhelming. "Sarah, I need you to understand what we're facing here," Jake said, sliding a thick folder across the polished wood surface. His usually confident demeanor was tempered with something I had never seen before: genuine concern. "This isn't some hastily thrown-together lawsuit. Your family has been planning this for months, maybe longer. They've built a comprehensive case with multiple angles of attack." I opened the folder with trembling fingers, and the first document hit me like a physical blow. "Petition for contest of last will and testament of Eleanor Margaret Hayes," it read in formal legal typeface. My grandmother's full name looked so cold and clinical on the page, stripped of all the warmth and personality that had defined her. Below that, in smaller but equally damning text, "Based on allegations of undue influence, duress, and diminished mental capacity of decedent." The words blurred as tears gathered in my eyes, but I forced myself to read every line. They claimed that grandmother had been suffering from early dementia that impaired her judgment. They alleged that I had systematically isolated her from other family members while positioning myself as her primary caregiver and confidant. Most painfully, they suggested that I had manipulated her emotions by creating a false narrative that other family members didn't care about her well-being. "Jake, this makes me sound like a monster," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet office. "They're describing someone I don't even recognize. According to this, I was some kind of calculating predator who preyed on a vulnerable elderly woman." The characterization was so far from reality that it felt like reading about a stranger, yet legally this stranger was me. Jake leaned forward, his expression serious but not without compassion. "That's exactly what they're trying to do, Sarah. Character assassination is a common tactic in will contests. They need to paint you as someone capable of manipulation and fraud because the alternative is admitting that your grandmother simply loved you more than she loved them." His bluntness was jarring but necessary. This wasn't about family dynamics anymore. It was about legal strategy and financial warfare. The next document in the pile was even more devastating. Affidavit of Maria Gonzalez, licensed practical nurse. Maria had been one of grandmother's home care providers during her final months, someone I had worked with regularly to coordinate care schedules. According to her sworn statement, I had been overly controlling about grandmother's daily routine and had restricted access to family members without medical justification. "Maria signed this?" I asked, unable to hide my shock. "I helped train her on grandmother's medication schedule. We worked together every day. I never restricted anyone's access." But even as I protested, I remembered moments that could be twisted to support this narrative. Times when I had asked visitors to come later because grandmother was having a bad day, or when I had suggested shorter visits during particularly difficult treatment periods. Jake pointed to another section of the affidavit. "She also claims that you frequently spoke negatively about other family members in front of your grandmother, suggesting they didn't care about her condition or recovery. Do you remember saying anything that could be interpreted that way?" His question wasn't accusatory, but I could see him already working through potential defense strategies.
I searched my memory desperately, trying to recall conversations with Maria during those emotionally charged months. I might have mentioned feeling overwhelmed, that I wished other people were more involved in her care. When Patricia missed 3 doctor's appointments in a row, I probably expressed frustration about having to handle everything alone. But I never tried to turn grandmother against anyone. The distinction felt important to me, but I was beginning to understand that intent mattered less than perception in legal proceedings. The third document made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped it. Affidavit of Robert Collins, attorney at law. My own brother-in-law, Patricia's husband, had signed a sworn statement claiming he had witnessed me coaching grandmother on how to discuss her will with other family members. According to Robert, I had specifically instructed her to emphasize how much more involved I was in her care compared to other relatives. Robert was barely ever at the house, I protested, my voice rising with indignation. The only time he visited was for family holidays, and even then he spent most of his time on his phone dealing with work calls. How could he have witnessed coaching sessions that never happened? But I realized that Robert's profession as an attorney would give his testimony extra weight with a judge and jury. Jake leaned forward and gently took the document from my hands. Sarah, I need you to focus on something important here. Robert Collins isn't just a witness in this case. He's also Patricia's husband and a partner in the law firm representing your family. There are serious ethical issues with him providing testimony while his firm handles the case. This could actually work in our favor. The revelation provided a small glimmer of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the next batch of documents. Financial
Records showing every gift grandmother had given me over the past 5 years, from birthday checks to the down payment assistance for my house. Each transaction was highlighted and annotated, transformed from expressions of love into evidence of a systematic financial relationship that suggested undue influence. They're making it look like I was bleeding her dry, I said, staring at the yellow highlighted amounts. But these were gifts, Jake. Birthday money, Christmas presents, help with my mortgage when I lost my job 3 years ago. She insisted on helping me, said that's what family was for. The recontextualization of these generous acts felt like another betrayal, as if my grandmother's love was being weaponized against both of us. Jake made notes on a legal pad as he reviewed each financial document. The problem is that the pattern they're establishing shows increasing amounts over time, culminating in the will change 6 months before her death. From a legal perspective, it creates a timeline that suggests escalating influence leading to the ultimate reward of inheritance. His clinical analysis was accurate, but heartbreaking. The most damaging document came near the end of the stack. Affidavit of Thomas Hayes, my uncle, Margaret's husband, and someone I had trusted implicitly for my entire life. According to his sworn statement, he had personally witnessed me becoming increasingly possessive of grandmother's time and attention in her final year. He claimed that I had actively discouraged family visits by emphasizing grandmother's fatigue and suggesting that too much social interaction was harmful to her recovery. Thomas helped me move furniture when grandmother couldn't navigate the stairs anymore, I said, my voice hollow with disbelief. He was there when we set up the hospital bed in the downstairs guest room. He thanked me for coordinating her care because he said he and Margaret didn't know how to handle medical equipment. Now he's saying I was possessive? The betrayal cut deeper because Thomas had always been the gentle, supportive uncle who never seemed to have an agenda. Jake closed the folder and leaned back in his chair carefully. Sarah, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need completely honest answers. Did you ever suggest to your grandmother that other family members weren't as committed to her care as you were? His question was fair but painful, forcing me to examine my own behavior during an incredibly stressful time. I thought carefully before answering. During her chemotherapy, there were weeks when I was the only one who showed up to treatments. Patricia would cancel at the last minute because of work conflicts. Margaret would send flowers instead of visiting, and Thomas would call to check in but couldn't drive her because of his back problems. When grandmother asked why she was going through treatments alone, I might have said that everyone shows love differently, but some people found hospitals difficult to handle. And how did she respond to those conversations? Jake's follow-up questions suggested he was already building our defense strategy. looking for ways to frame my actions as responses to family dynamics rather than manipulation attempts. She said she understood that people handled illness differently, but that she was grateful to have someone who wasn't afraid of the medical aspect. She told me once that she felt comfortable being vulnerable around me because I didn't try to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. The memory brought fresh tears, remembering how much strength it had taken for grandmother to admit she needed help. Jake made more notes, then reached for another folder. Now I need to show you the most concerning part of their case. They've filed a motion for expedited proceedings claiming that you're actively dissipating estate assets and that delay would cause irreparable harm to the beneficiaries. He opened the new folder to reveal bank statements and property records that I didn't recognize. What do you mean, dissipating assets? I haven't touched anything that belonged to grandmother except what was specifically left to me in the will. Confusion mixed with panic as I tried to understand what new accusation they were leveling against me. Jake pointed to highlighted entries on several bank statements. According to these documents, significant withdrawals were made from your grandmother's accounts in the months before her death. They're claiming you had access to her finances and used that access to transfer money to yourself before the will could be probated. The accusation was so outrageous that I could only stare at the papers in shock. I never had access to her bank accounts, I insisted, my voice rising. She handled her own finances until the very end. The only thing I ever did was drive her to the bank when she needed to make deposits or withdrawals in person. But even as I was speaking, I remembered that there had been times when grandmother had asked me to help her fill out deposit slips because her arthritis made writing difficult. Jake continued reviewing the financial documents, his expression growing more serious. Sarah, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need completely honest answers. There have been several large withdrawals made from your grandmother's accounts in the months before her death. They're claiming you had access to her finances and used that access to transfer money to yourself before the will could be probated. Do you have any documentation showing your grandmother's knowledge or approval of those withdrawals? Jake's question revealed the sophistication of the trap that had been set for me. I struggled to remember the details of those final months when grandmother's health was declining rapidly. She was still paying her own bills, managing her own expenses. If there were large withdrawals, she must have authorized them for something specific, maybe medical expenses that weren't covered by insurance, or home modifications for her mobility accessibility. She mentioned several times that she was spending money to make the house safer for her mobility issues. Jake made a note to investigate the timing and purpose of the withdrawals, but I could see the concern in his expression. Sarah, even if those transactions were legitimate, the fact that you had access creates an appearance of financial control that supports their undue influence claim.
Influence claims. Combined with the increasing gifts over time and the significant inheritance, it creates a pattern that will be difficult to explain away. The weight of their carefully constructed case was becoming overwhelming. Every act of love and care had been documented, recontextualized, and transformed into evidence of a calculated scheme to defraud an elderly woman. The family members who had once praised my devotion were now testifying that the same devotion was actually manipulation. The financial assistance that grandmother had insisted on providing was now characterized as the fruits of systematic exploitation. Jake, how do we fight this? I asked, feeling more defeated than I had since this nightmare began. They've taken every good thing about my relationship with grandmother and turned it into something ugly and predatory. How do I prove that love isn't manipulation, that care isn't control, that gratitude isn't greed? Jake closed the folders and looked directly at me, his expression serious, but not without hope. We fight it with truth, Sarah. We gather evidence that shows the real nature of your relationship with your grandmother. We find witnesses who can testify to your character and your genuine care for her well-being. We document the timeline of your involvement in her care and show that it was responsive to her needs, not manipulative of her vulnerabilities. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making a list. We'll need medical records showing the progression of her illness and the increasing care requirements. We'll need testimony from doctors and nurses who worked with both of you and can speak to the appropriateness of your involvement. We'll need evidence of other family members' lack of involvement to show that someone had to step up to provide necessary care. The task ahead seemed monumental, but for the first time since Jake's phone call the night before, I felt a spark of hope. What about the ethical issues with Robert Collins providing testimony while his firm represents the family? Can we use that to challenge their case? I was grasping for any advantage we could find in this legal battlefield. Absolutely, Jake replied, his confidence returning. That's a serious conflict of interest that could invalidate his testimony and potentially call into question the entire legal strategy. We'll file motions challenging his participation and demanding disclosure of any communications between him and the other family members about this case. He was already strategizing, shifting from defensive to offensive thinking. But as I left Jake's office that afternoon, carrying copies of all the accusations against me, I realized that winning the legal battle was only part of the challenge I faced. Even if we successfully defended against the will contest, the damage to family relationships was permanent. The people who had raised me, supported me, and claimed to love me had chosen to destroy my reputation rather than accept grandmother's final wishes about her estate. The elevator ride down from Jake's office felt like a descent into a new reality, where nothing was certain anymore. The Phoenix skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, a landscape that looked the same, but felt fundamentally different now that I understood how completely my world had shifted. The woman who had woken up yesterday morning, believing in family loyalty and shared love, no longer existed. In her place was someone who had to learn to navigate a world where the people closest to you could become your most dangerous enemies. Part 3. The pattern recognition. The drive home from Jake's office took me through neighborhoods where I had grown up, past the elementary school where Patricia and I had walked together every morning, by the park where family barbecues had filled summer weekends with laughter and connection. Everything looked exactly the same, but now these familiar sights felt like museum exhibits from a life that no longer existed. The family I thought I knew had been replaced by strangers who shared my DNA but none of my values. That evening, I sat at my home office with a yellow legal pad, trying to reconstruct the timeline of my relationship with grandmother during her final years. Jake had been right about needing to document the truth, but as I began writing down memories, a different pattern started to emerge. Incidents I had dismissed as stress or miscommunication began to line up in ways that suggested something much more calculated had been happening. I started with the period immediately after grandfather's death 4 years ago, when the family dynamics had first begun to shift in subtle ways. Grandmother had been devastated by the loss of her husband of 53 years, and everyone had agreed that she needed extra support and attention. Initially, all of us had rallied around her, taking turns visiting, helping with household tasks, and providing emotional support during her grief. But as the months passed, I noticed that other family members began to find excuses for reducing their involvement. Patricia started citing increased work responsibilities that required longer hours and weekend commitments. Margaret developed a series of minor health issues that made it difficult for her to help with physically demanding tasks like grocery shopping or house cleaning. Thomas began having back problems that prevented him from assisting with yard work or home maintenance projects. At the time, I had accepted these explanations without question and simply increased my own involvement to fill the gaps. If Patricia couldn't drive grandmother to doctor appointments, I rearranged my work schedule to provide transportation. When Margaret couldn't help with grocery shopping, I started doing weekly shopping trips and meal preparation. If Thomas couldn't maintain the yard, I hired a landscaping service and managed the household maintenance needs. What I had interpreted as natural family dynamics now looked different through the lens of current events. Had the gradual withdrawal of other family members been orchestrated to create exactly the situation they were now describing? Had they deliberately stepped back from grandmother's care while encouraging me to step forward, knowing that increased involvement could later be characterized as undue influence? I remember a conversation with Patricia about 6 months after grandfather's death, when she had specifically suggested that I was so much better at handling grandmother's medical needs because I was more patient with all the doctor visits and prescription management.
Involvement, they had actively deferred to my judgment about grandmother's care, while simultaneously creating distance between themselves and the daily realities of her declining health. When decisions needed to be made about home modifications for accessibility, they said I had the best understanding of her needs. When medical questions arose, they suggested I was most qualified to discuss options with her doctors because I attended more appointments. Margaret had even mentioned during one family gathering that it was wonderful how grandmother had taken to relying on Sarah for so many things, because it meant the rest of us didn't have to worry about her daily care needs. The comment had seemed like gratitude at the time, but now it sounded like the setup for a future narrative about excessive dependence and control. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through text message chains from the past few years, looking for evidence of these patterns. The messages painted a clear picture of family members consistently declining opportunities to be involved in grandmother's care while expressing appreciation for my willingness to handle increasing responsibilities. Patricia had sent dozens of messages saying things like, "Thank goodness you're available to take her to that appointment," and "I don't know what we'd do without you managing her medications." Margaret's messages were even more revealing. "You're so much better at understanding all those medical terms," she had written after declining to attend a consultation with grandmother's oncologist. "She trusts your judgment more than anyone else's anyway." Another message, sent just 2 months before grandmother's death, said, "It's such a relief knowing you're handling everything. The rest of us would just get in the way." Thomas had been more direct in his communications, often stating explicitly that he was grateful to let Sarah handle the medical stuff because he wouldn't know what questions to ask anyway. His messages consistently portrayed me as the family member best equipped to make healthcare decisions and manage grandmother's daily needs. The pattern was undeniable. For nearly 3 years, other family members had systematically withdrawn from hands-on caregiving while encouraging me to take on increasing responsibilities. They had praised my involvement, expressed gratitude for my dedication, and explicitly stated that they preferred to defer to my judgment about grandmother's care needs. Now, they were using that same involvement as evidence that I had inappropriately influenced and controlled her. But the most disturbing realization came when I found a group text chain from 8 months before grandmother's death. The conversation had started with Margaret expressing concern about grandmother's increasing frailty and questioning whether she was still capable of making good decisions about her care. Patricia had responded by saying she was worried about Mom becoming too dependent on any one person and suggesting that maybe the family needed to reassess the current arrangement. At the time, I had interpreted these messages as general concern about grandmother's decline and her need for professional care assistance. But reading them now, they looked like the opening moves in a strategy to establish concerns about grandmother's mental capacity and my level of influence over her decisions. The timing was particularly significant because it coincided with the period when grandmother had first mentioned wanting to update her will to reflect the reality of who was actually involved in her daily care. Thomas had contributed to that text chain by noting that grandmother seemed confused sometimes about which family members were helping with what, and that she had mentioned feeling disappointed that some people weren't visiting as much as they used to. Instead of recognizing this as a natural response to their reduced involvement, he had framed it as potential evidence of mental decline and manipulation. The group conversation had concluded with an agreement that they should keep an eye on the situation and make sure Mom isn't being influenced to make decisions that aren't in her best interest. Reading those words now, I realized they had been planning this challenge to her will months before she had even died, laying the groundwork for claims about her mental capacity and my undue influence. I set down my phone and walked to the kitchen, feeling nauseous as the full scope of their deception became clear. This wasn't a case of grief-stricken family members making poor decisions in the aftermath of loss. This was a calculated, multi-year strategy to position themselves as concerned but distant relatives, while painting me as an increasingly controlling caregiver who had overstepped appropriate boundaries. David found me standing at the kitchen counter, staring out at our backyard, where the desert sunset painted the mountains in brilliant orange and pink.
"How was the meeting with Jake?" he asked, but when he saw my expression, his tone shifted to concern. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned to face him, struggling to find words for what I had discovered. "David, I think they've been planning this for years. Not just the lawsuit, but the entire setup. They deliberately withdrew from grandmother's care while encouraging me to get more involved, then used that involvement as evidence against me." Those words sounded paranoid, even to my own ears, but the evidence was undeniable. David listened as I walked him through the timeline, showing him the text messages and explaining how the pattern of withdrawal and deferral had created exactly the situation they were now describing as problematic. His expression grew more serious as I laid out the evidence, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, that's not just manipulation, that's fraud. They created a situation where you had no choice but to increase your involvement in her care, then used that involvement to claim you were exerting undue influence. It's like setting a fire and then blaming the firefighter for being at the scene." His analogy was apt, but it also highlighted how difficult it would be to prove our interpretation versus their narrative. I pulled out my laptop and began forwarding the text message chains to Jake, knowing that this evidence could be crucial to our defense. But even this documentation could be interpreted multiple ways. They could claim that their messages showed appropriate concern about grandmother's well-being and my increasing control over her decisions. The same evidence that proved their deliberate withdrawal could be framed as responsible family members recognizing warning signs of undue influence. The sophistication of their strategy was breathtaking in its cynicism.
They had spent years creating the very situation they were now condemning, documenting their concerns about it in real time to establish a paper trail that supported their current narrative. Every text message expressing gratitude for my involvement could be reframed as worry about my excessive control. Every statement deferring to my judgment could be characterized as evidence that I had assumed inappropriate authority over grandmother's decisions. That night, I barely slept, my mind churning through memories and trying to separate genuine moments from calculated manipulation. Had Patricia's suggestion that I was better with medical stuff been honest assessment or strategic positioning? When Margaret said grandmother trusted my judgment, was she acknowledging my competence or laying groundwork for future claims about undue influence? How many of our family interactions over the past few years had been performance rather than genuine relationship? The next morning brought another devastating realization when I found an email from Patricia in my grandmother's account, an account I had been helping her manage because her arthritis made typing difficult. The email, sent to an attorney I didn't recognize, discussed concerns about mother's increasing dependence on Sarah and requested information about options for protecting elderly family members from potential financial exploitation. The email was dated 5 months before grandmother's death, during a period when Patricia was publicly praising my dedication to grandmother's care while privately investigating legal options for challenging my involvement. The duplicity was staggering. She had been building a case against me while expressing gratitude for my help, gathering evidence for a future lawsuit while encouraging me to take on additional responsibilities. I realized that every family gathering over the past year had been an opportunity for them to observe and document my interactions with grandmother, looking for evidence that could support their narrative of undue influence. Every conversation about grandmother's needs or preferences had been potential ammunition for their case. They had turned family relationships into surveillance operations, transforming love into legal strategy. The woman who had baked cookies with hope for reconciliation just 2 days ago felt like someone from another lifetime. In her place was someone who understood that the people closest to you could be the most dangerous enemies of all, and that family bonds could be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. The battle ahead wasn't just about inheritance or legal vindication. It was about whether truth could survive a systematic campaign of lies, backed by years of careful planning and substantial financial resources. Part 4. The Opposition's Resources. Jake Morrison's voice carried a gravity I had never heard before when he called me at 7:30 the next morning.
Sarah, we need to meet immediately. I've discovered something about your family's legal representation that changes everything. His urgent tone sent a chill through me as I rushed to get dressed, knowing that whatever he had found would make our already difficult situation even more complex. The law offices of Collins and Associates occupied 3 full floors of one of Phoenix's most prestigious downtown towers, their lobby decorated with awards and accolades that spoke to their success in high-stakes litigation. As I sat across from Jake in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, he spread out research materials that revealed just how powerful the forces aligned against me really were. Robert Collins isn't just Patricia's husband, Jake began, his voice low despite the busy morning crowd around us. He's a senior partner in one of the most successful estate litigation firms in the Southwest. They specialize in will contests and have a reputation for taking cases they know they can win. Their success rate is over 80%, and they're known for their aggressive tactics and willingness to spend whatever it takes to prevail. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. It was a professional legal campaign being waged by experts who made their living destroying inheritance plans and discrediting beneficiaries. Jake, are you saying they took this case because they believe they can win, or because Robert has inside information about our family dynamics? Jake's expression was grim as he continued his briefing. Both, potentially. Think about it, Sarah. Robert has been present at family gatherings for years. He's heard private conversations about your grandmother's condition, your involvement in her care, and family members' concerns about various situations. He knows intimate details about your family dynamics that would normally take months of investigation to uncover. The realization that family dinners and holiday celebrations had been intelligence-gathering opportunities made me feel violated in a way I hadn't expected. Every casual conversation about grandmother's health, every discussion about care arrangements, every moment of family vulnerability had been observed by someone who was now using that information to build a case against me. There's more, Jake continued, pulling out another folder. Collins and Associates has a war chest that allows them to pursue cases for months or years without concern about legal fees. They can afford to hire the best expert witnesses, conduct extensive investigations, and drag out proceedings until their opponents run out of resources to fight back. He showed me fee schedules that made my head spin with their astronomical hourly rates and retainer requirements. I thought about my own financial situation. Comfortable, but not unlimited, with most of my savings tied up in the house that grandmother had helped me purchase. Jake, how long can we afford to fight this? What happens if they drag it out longer than I can finance a defense? The question was painful but necessary, as I realized that my family might be counting on financial exhaustion as much as legal victory. That's exactly their strategy, Jake replied. They file extensive motions that require expensive responses, demand depositions that eat up legal fees, and schedule hearings that require preparation time and expert witness fees. They're banking on the fact that you'll eventually run out of money and be forced to settle on their terms. His assessment was clinical, but terrifying in its implications. The folder he handed me next contained information about the expert witnesses Collins and Associates had retained for the case. Dr. Marcus Steinberg, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in testifying about diminished mental capacity in elderly patients. Dr. Helen Morrison, a forensic accountant who examined financial transactions for evidence of undue influence. Dr. James Patterson, a family dynamics expert who analyzed caregiver relationships for signs of manipulation and control. These aren't just any experts, Jake explained. These are people who make substantial portions of their income testifying in will contests. They know exactly what to say to support claims of undue influence, and they're very good at making their opinions sound authoritative and convincing to juries. The professional nature of their testimony operation was intimidating in its sophistication. I studied the credentials of each expert witness, noting their impressive academic backgrounds and extensive experience in court proceedings. But Jake, they never even met my grandmother. How can they testify about her mental capacity or our relationship? The question seemed obvious to me, but I suspected the legal system allowed for opinions I wouldn't consider valid. Expert witnesses don't need direct knowledge of the specific case, Jake explained. They review medical records, depositions, and other evidence, then provide opinions based on their professional expertise. Dr. Steinberg will analyze your grandmother's medical records and claim that her conditions made her vulnerable to manipulation. Dr. Morrison will examine the financial transactions and gift patterns to argue that they show systematic exploitation. Dr. Patterson will review witness statements about your caregiving relationship and conclude that it crossed appropriate boundaries. The systematic nature of their approach was becoming clear. They weren't just challenging the will, they were building a comprehensive narrative supported by multiple professional opinions that would be difficult for a jury to dismiss. Every aspect of my relationship with grandmother was being analyzed and reframed by experts who were paid to find evidence of wrongdoing. What about our expert witnesses? I asked, hoping that we could counter their professional opinions with equally credible testimony. Can we find people who will review the same evidence and reach different conclusions? The legal battle was starting to feel like competing narratives supported by hired experts rather than a search for truth. Jake nodded, but his expression remained concerned. We can and will retain our own experts, but we're at a disadvantage because Collins and Associates got to them first. The best experts in this field work regularly with estate litigation firms, and many of them have ongoing relationships with Collins and Associates that would create conflicts of interest if they worked for us. The idea that expert witnesses could be cornered by one side seemed fundamentally unfair. He pulled out another document that made my heart sink further. They've also hired a private investigation firm to conduct background research on you, your finances, and your relationships. Blackstone Investigations is one of the most thorough firms in the business, and they're not bound by the same ethical constraints as attorneys. They can investigate your personal life, interview people from your past, and look for any information that might be used to attack your character or credibility. The invasion of privacy was staggering, but the strategic implications were even worse. Jake, what are they looking for? What could they possibly find that would be relevant to my relationship with grandmother? I tried to think of anything in my background that could be twisted into evidence of character flaws or predatory behavior. They're looking for patterns, Jake replied. Any previous situations where you were involved in financial transactions with elderly relatives, any history of being named in wills or receiving substantial gifts, any relationships that could be characterized as involving power imbalances or manipulation. They're also looking for evidence of financial problems that might establish motive for exploiting your grandmother's generosity. I thought through my personal history, trying to anticipate what a hostile investigation might uncover. I helped my great-aunt organize her finances when she developed dementia 8 years ago, but that was with the full knowledge and approval of her children. I received a small inheritance when she died, but it was completely appropriate, and no one in the family objected. Even as I spoke, I could see how these facts might be twisted into a pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly relatives. That's exactly the kind of information they'll use, Jake confirmed. They'll argue that you have a history of inserting yourself into elderly relatives' financial affairs and benefiting from those relationships. The fact that no one objected at the time won't matter. They'll claim that shows you're skilled at manipulating family dynamics to avoid suspicion. The reinterpretation of legitimate family assistance as predatory behavior was becoming a consistent theme. The next revelation was even more disturbing. Collins and Associates has also retained a jury consulting firm to help them select jurors who are most likely to be sympathetic to their narrative. They'll conduct focus groups to test different versions of their story and identify the most effective ways to present their case. The level of preparation and professional support was overwhelming. I realized that what I had initially seen as a family dispute had actually attracted a legal team that typically handled multi-million-dollar corporate litigation. Jake, why are they bringing this level of firepower to a family will contest? Even if they win everything, the legal fees must be approaching the value of the estate itself. The economics didn't make sense unless there were factors I wasn't seeing. Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. That's what worries me, Sarah. Either there's more money involved than we know about, Or this isn't really about money. Sometimes will contests are about revenge, control, or sending messages to other family members about the consequences of crossing certain people. His suggestion that the lawsuit might be motivated by factors beyond inheritance was chilling. The possibility that Patricia, Margaret, and Thomas were willing to spend enormous sums of money on legal fees just to destroy my reputation and deny me grandmother's final gift was almost too cruel to accept. But as I thought about their behavior over the past few years, I realized that control and domination had always been important to them in ways that went beyond financial considerations. There's one more thing, Jake said, pulling out a final document. Collins and Associates has also filed a motion requesting that all estate assets be frozen pending the outcome of the case. If the judge grants this motion, you won't be able to access any inheritance funds to pay for your legal defense. You'll have to finance this fight entirely from your own resources while they use estate funds to pay their legal bills. The strategic brilliance of this move was obvious and devastating. They could use grandmother's money to fight me while ensuring that I couldn't use my inheritance to defend myself. The asymmetry was designed to guarantee that
They could outspend me, regardless of the merits of our respective cases. As I walked back to my car from that meeting, the Phoenix skyline looked different than it had just a few hours earlier. The gleaming towers that had once represented opportunity and success now seemed like monuments to a legal system where justice could be purchased by whoever had the deepest pockets and the most ruthless strategy. My family hadn't just filed a lawsuit. They had declared war using professional weapons I could barely afford to counter. The realization that Robert Collins had been gathering intelligence about our family for years while pretending to be a supportive relative added a layer of betrayal that went beyond anything I had imagined. Every family celebration had been compromised, every private conversation potentially cataloged for future use, every moment of vulnerability transformed into ammunition for a legal assault I had never seen coming. Part 3. The strategic pivot. The weight of Collins and Associates resources pressed down on me like desert heat as I drove through Scottsdale that evening, but somewhere between the law office and my driveway, something fundamental shifted inside me. The overwhelming fear that had consumed me since Jake's first phone call was transforming into something sharper and more focused. They had made a critical error in showing their hand so completely, revealing not just their strategy, but their assumption that I would crumble under the pressure of their professional assault. David was waiting in the kitchen when I arrived home, his laptop open on the counter, and a determined expression on his face that I hadn't seen since our early dating days when he was working on particularly challenging technical projects. "How bad is it?" he asked without preamble, and I appreciated his directness after a day of legal euphemisms and strategic obfuscation. I told him everything Jake had revealed about Collins and Associates, their expert witnesses, the private investigators, and the motion to freeze estate assets. David listened without interruption, his jaw tightening as I described the scope of resources aligned against us and the systematic nature of their approach. When I finished, he closed his laptop and looked directly at me with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "Sarah, they've made this into a war, which means we need to start thinking like warriors instead of victims," he said, his voice carrying authority I had rarely heard from him. "You've been reacting to their moves, trying to defend against their accusations, but defense alone isn't going to win this fight. We need to go on the offensive and find ways to attack their credibility and expose their motivations." His shift from supportive spouse to strategic advisor surprised me, but I found his confidence infectious. "What are you thinking?" I asked, sensing that he had already begun formulating some kind of plan during the hours I had spent learning about our opponent's advantages. David pulled out a notebook filled with his precise handwriting, pages of analysis that he must have been working on while I was meeting with Jake. "I've been thinking about this situation from a systems perspective, looking for vulnerabilities in their approach that we can exploit. They're fighting like a traditional law firm, but they've made assumptions about our capabilities that might not be accurate." He flipped to a page covered with names and connections, a family tree that included not just blood relatives, but professional relationships and financial ties. "Robert Collins is their biggest asset and their
biggest liability, Sarah. His inside knowledge of your family gives them tremendous advantages. But his personal involvement also creates exposure that a professional law firm would normally never accept. The diagram showed connections I hadn't considered, lines drawn between Robert's law practice and his marriage to Patricia, between his professional reputation and his personal financial interest in the outcome of grandmother's estate. "What kind of exposure are you thinking about?" I asked, beginning to see possibilities I had missed in my emotional response to their betrayal. "Conflict of interest is just the beginning," David replied, pointing to specific notations on his chart. "Robert has been present for privileged family communications that he's now using in a professional capacity. He's personally benefiting from legal strategies that he helped develop using confidential information. Most importantly, he's allowed his law firm to take a case where he has direct financial interest in the outcome." The implications were starting to become clear, but David continued before I could fully process them. "Beyond the ethical violations, there's a strategic problem with their approach. They're fighting this case as if you're an isolated individual with limited resources, but they don't know everything about our situation. They've made assumptions about our capabilities that could work in our favor if we're smart about how we respond." I studied his notes more carefully, seeing references to investigative techniques and information gathering methods that seemed beyond what I would expect from a professional IT consultant. "David, how do you know so much about legal strategy and investigation tactics? This looks like something a professional would put together." His thoroughness was impressive, but puzzling given his technical background. David hesitated for a moment, and I caught something in his expression that I had never seen before. A calculation about how much to reveal, as if he was weighing the risks and benefits of sharing information with me. "I've done some consulting work that involved understanding how investigations and legal proceedings work. Technical security projects sometimes require knowledge of how information gets used in legal contexts." His explanation felt incomplete, but before I could ask follow-up questions, he had moved on to more immediate concerns. "The key point is that Collins & Associates is treating this like a standard will contest, but there are aspects of the situation that could expose them to significant professional and personal consequences if we handle our response correctly. They're vulnerable in ways they don't realize." David showed me another page of his analysis, this one focused on timeline and documentation. "They've been planning this for months, maybe years, but that extended timeline creates opportunities for us. The longer they've been working on this case, the more communications they've generated, the more people they've involved, and the more chances they've had to make mistakes or cross ethical lines. The idea that their careful planning might have created weaknesses rather than just strengths was encouraging, but I still felt overwhelmed by the resources they could bring to bear against us. Even if they've made mistakes, David, they still have unlimited legal budgets, professional expert witnesses."
Private investigators? How do we compete with that kind of firepower? David's smile was different than usual, carrying an edge of confidence that seemed almost predatory. "We don't compete with their resources, Sarah. We make their resources work against them. Every expert witness they hire is someone who can be cross-examined about their methodology and bias. Every private investigator they employ creates a paper trail that can be subpoenaed. Every professional they involve increases the chance that someone will make an error or reveal information they didn't intend to share." He pulled out his laptop and opened a document that looked like a detailed project plan, complete with timelines, resource requirements, and milestone objectives. "I've been thinking about this systematically, and I believe we can turn their advantages into disadvantages if we approach this correctly. But it requires us to be more aggressive and more strategic than they're expecting." The document outlined a multi-phase approach that was far more sophisticated than anything I had imagined possible. Phase 1 involved intensive investigation of Collins & Associates' other cases, looking for patterns of behavior that might reveal ethical violations or questionable tactics. Phase 2 focused on documenting the timeline of family members' withdrawal from grandmother's care and their subsequent coordination on legal strategy. Phase 3 involved financial analysis of the resources being devoted to the case and the question of who was really funding the extensive legal campaign. "David, this looks like something a professional investigative firm would put together," I said, studying the detailed action items and resource allocations. "How do you know how to plan something like this?"
His expertise was beginning to seem far beyond what any IT consulting work would require. Again, I caught that moment of calculation in his expression, as if he was deciding how much truth to share. I've worked on projects that required understanding how complex investigations get organized and executed, he said. The principles are similar regardless of whether you're investigating technical security breaches or legal misconduct. Before I could press for more details, David had moved on to immediate next steps. The most important thing right now is to start documenting everything we can about their coordination and planning. If we can prove that this lawsuit was orchestrated over an extended period using inside information from Robert's position in the family, we can potentially get the entire case dismissed on ethical grounds. He showed me a list of information sources we needed to investigate, from family email accounts and text message records to public filings related to Collins and Associates' other cases. Sarah, I need you to think carefully about any communications you might have access to that could show coordination between family members and Robert's law firm. Email accounts, shared documents, anything that might reveal how long they've been planning this. The mention of shared documents reminded me of something I had forgotten in the chaos of recent revelations. David, grandmother gave me access to her email account and cloud storage to help her organize digital photos and documents. I still have those passwords, and I never thought to check whether family members might have been communicating with her accounts or accessing her files. David's eyes sharpened with interest. That could be extremely valuable, but we need to be very careful about how we access and document anything we find. If there's evidence of coordination or planning in those accounts, we need to preserve it in a way that will be admissible in court proceedings. His immediate shift to thinking about legal admissibility suggested more familiarity with evidence handling than I would expect from technical consulting. I pulled out my phone and began accessing grandmother's cloud storage, something I had avoided doing since her death because it felt too painful to browse through her personal files. But now those same files might contain evidence that could save my inheritance and expose my family's deception. David watched over my shoulder as I navigated through folders filled with family photos, financial documents, and correspondence. The first discovery was in grandmother's email account, where a search for Robert's name revealed dozens of messages that I had never seen before. Most were routine family communications, but several from the months before her death dealt with legal and financial topics that seemed unusual for casual correspondence. One email, sent just 6 weeks before grandmother died, contained a draft document titled Family Asset Protection Strategy that had been forwarded from Robert's professional email address. "Sarah, this is huge," David said, reading over my shoulder. "If Robert was providing legal advice to your grandmother about asset protection while simultaneously planning to challenge her will, that's a massive conflict of interest that could invalidate everything they're trying to do." His excitement was palpable, but I was struggling to process the implications of what we were seeing. The document outlined strategies for protecting family assets from potential challenges and included specific recommendations about how to structure gifts and inheritance decisions to minimize opportunities for successful will contests. The irony was staggering. Robert had been advising grandmother on how to protect her estate decisions while secretly planning to attack those same decisions after her death. David immediately began taking screenshots and organizing the documents for preservation, his approach methodical and professional in ways that continue to surprise me. "He need to download everything and preserve it exactly as we found it," he said. "This evidence could be the key to exposing their entire strategy, but only if we handle it correctly from a legal perspective." As we continued searching through grandmother's files, a pattern of communication emerged that was even more damning than I had expected. Text message records showed regular coordination between Patricia, Margaret, Thomas, and Robert about grandmother's condition, her relationship with me, and their concerns about her estate planning decisions. The messages revealed a level of planning and coordination that contradicted their public claims that the lawsuit was a spontaneous response to discovering the terms of her will. One text chain from 4 months before grandmother died was particularly revealing. Patricia had written, "Robert thinks we need more documentation of Sarah's inappropriate influence before Mom makes any final decisions about the will." Margaret had responded, "I've been keeping notes about Sarah's controlling behavior during medical appointments."
Appointments. Thomas had added, "We should all be more observant about recording problematic interactions." They were building their case while pretending to support your involvement in her care, David observed, his voice tight with anger. This isn't just a will contest, Sarah. This is a conspiracy that involved systematic deception over an extended period. They were documenting evidence for a lawsuit while encouraging the very behavior they now claim was inappropriate. The discovery of this coordinated campaign was simultaneously vindicating and heartbreaking. It proved that their accusations were premeditated rather than sincere, but it also revealed the depth of their betrayal and the calculated nature of their deception. People I had loved and trusted for my entire life had been treating me like a subject of investigation rather than a family member. David spent the rest of the evening organizing and cataloging the evidence we had discovered, his approach systematic and thorough in ways that impressed me, even as I grieved for the family relationships that were now permanently destroyed. "This changes everything, Sarah," he said as he compiled the final documentation. "We're not just defending against their accusations anymore. We're exposing a conspiracy that could have serious professional consequences for Robert and potentially criminal implications for all of them." The shift from defense to offense felt empowering, but I was also concerned about the escalation it represented. "David, if we pursue this aggressively, there's no going back. Whatever chance we might have had for eventual family reconciliation will be completely destroyed." The possibility of permanently burning bridges with people who had raised me was painful despite everything they had done. David looked up from his laptop, his expression serious but compassionate. "Sarah, they destroyed those relationships when they decided to lie about you in legal proceedings. You can't reconcile with people who are actively trying to destroy your reputation and steal your inheritance. The only question now is whether you're going to let them succeed or whether you're going to fight back with everything we've got." His words crystallized something that had been forming in my mind throughout this ordeal. The family I thought I knew had never really existed or had died along with grandmother. The people filing lawsuits against me were strangers wearing familiar faces, and I owed them nothing beyond what the law required. If they wanted to make this a war, then I would give them the fight they were asking for. That night, I finally slept soundly for the first time since this nightmare began. Not because the situation had improved, but because I finally understood that we had weapons to fight back with. The evidence we had discovered wouldn't just defend against their accusations, it would expose them as the calculated liars and manipulators they had become. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Part 5. The Breakthrough Discovery. The next morning brought clarity that felt like desert sunrise after a long, dark night. I called Jake Morrison before 8 o'clock, my voice steady with newfound determination, as I outlined the evidence David and I had discovered in grandmother's digital files. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Jake spoke, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and professional caution. "Sarah, if this documentation is authentic and admissible, it doesn't just defend against their lawsuit, it potentially destroys their credibility and exposes them to sanctions for bringing frivolous claims based on manufactured evidence," Jake said. "But we need to be extremely careful about how we present this information and make sure we haven't compromised its legal value by accessing it improperly." I explained that grandmother had given me legitimate access to her accounts for the purpose of helping her organize digital files, and that I had preserved everything exactly as we found it, without altering or deleting any documents. Jake's relief was audible as he confirmed that our discovery methods wouldn't compromise the admissibility of the evidence in court proceedings. "We need to meet immediately to review everything you found and develop a strategy for using it effectively. This kind of evidence can be a game changer, but only if we present it at the right time and in the right way. We also need to investigate whether there are additional sources of information that might support what you've already discovered." David insisted on accompanying me to the meeting with Jake, claiming he wanted to provide technical expertise about digital evidence preservation and authentication. I was grateful for his support, though I continued to be surprised by his depth of knowledge about investigative procedures and legal requirements. His transformation from supportive spouse to strategic advisor had been so complete that I sometimes felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Jake's conference room that morning felt different than before, charged with possibility rather than weighted down by defensive concerns. As we spread out the evidence we had discovered, Jake's excitement became increasingly visible despite his professional training to maintain composure. "This is extraordinary," he said, studying the timeline of coordinated communications.
They've documented their own conspiracy in detail, creating a paper trail that proves premeditation and coordination. David had prepared a comprehensive analysis of the digital evidence, complete with metadata analysis and authentication protocols that impressed even Jake with their thoroughness. Every document is timestamped and verified, David explained. We can prove exactly when each communication occurred and demonstrate that the evidence hasn't been altered or manipulated in any way. The technical precision of David's work continued to surprise me, but Jake seemed to accept his expertise without question. This level of documentation will be crucial if Collins and Associates tries to challenge the authenticity of our evidence. They'll look for any procedural errors or technical flaws they can use to get it excluded from proceedings. As we reviewed the evidence together, additional patterns emerged that none of us had noticed during our initial discovery. The timeline of Robert's legal advice to grandmother coincided almost exactly with increased coordination between family members about documenting my inappropriate behavior. His recommendations for protecting estate assets were immediately followed by intensified efforts to gather evidence that could be used to challenge the very protections he had advised grandmother to implement. This isn't just conflict of interest, Jake observed. This is potentially criminal fraud. Robert was providing legal services to your grandmother while secretly planning to attack those very protections.
Same services for the benefit of his wife and her family. He was literally working both sides of a legal conflict while pretending to be a neutral advisor. David pulled out additional documentation he had prepared overnight, showing financial connections between Robert's law firm and the expert witnesses they had retained for the case. I did some research on Collins and Associates' other cases, and I found interesting patterns in their expert witness selection and fee arrangements, he said. The same experts appear repeatedly in their will contests, and the fee structures suggest ongoing professional relationships that go beyond individual case representation. The implications were staggering. Collins and Associates wasn't just using expert witnesses, they were essentially employing a stable of professionals who regularly testified in support of their legal strategies. If we can prove that these expert witnesses have financial incentives to reach conclusions that support Collins and Associates' cases, we can potentially discredit their entire testimony, Jake said. I studied David's research, noting the thoroughness and sophistication of his investigation into the law firm's practices. David, this is incredibly detailed work. How did you gather all this information so quickly? His capability was beginning to seem far beyond what any IT consulting background would provide. David's response was characteristically evasive. Public records, professional databases, financial filings, most of this information is available if you know where to look and how to analyze it systematically. But the casual way he described accessing complex databases and conducting financial analysis suggested expertise that went well beyond basic research skills. Jake didn't seem surprised by David's capabilities, accepting his contributions as if technical professionals routinely conducted sophisticated legal and financial investigations. This research gives us multiple angles of attack, Jake said. We can challenge their expert witnesses' credibility, expose the financial relationships that bias their testimony, and demonstrate that Collins and Associates has a pattern of using questionable tactics in will contests. The strategic session continued for 3 hours as we developed a comprehensive plan for using our evidence to maximum effect. Rather than simply defending against their accusations, we would file counterclaims alleging conspiracy, fraud, and professional misconduct. Instead of reacting to their expert witnesses, we would preemptively attack their credibility and financial motivations. Most importantly, we would shift the focus from defending my relationship with grandmother to exposing their systematic deception and manipulation. The key is timing, Jake explained as we finalized our strategy. We need to let them commit fully to their current narrative before we reveal evidence that contradicts their claims. If we show our hand too early, they'll have time to adjust their strategy and develop alternative arguments. But if we wait until they're locked into their positions, this evidence will be devastating. David suggested additional investigation that could strengthen our position even further. We should look into the private investigation firm they hired and see if we can document any illegal or unethical information gathering activities, he said. If Blackstone Investigations crossed any lines in their research about Sarah, that could provide additional grounds for sanctions and potentially criminal charges. The idea of investigating the investigators appealed to my growing desire for offensive action.
but I was concerned about the resources and expertise such an investigation would require. David, how do we investigate a professional investigation firm? Don't they know how to avoid creating evidence of questionable activities? My question revealed how much I was relying on his strategic thinking, despite my continuing puzzlement about his background. Every organization leaves digital footprints: communication records, financial transactions, travel documents, database access logs. There are always traces of what investigative firms do and how they do it. The key is knowing where to look and having the technical skills to analyze what you find. His confidence suggested practical experience with such investigations rather than theoretical knowledge. Jake made notes about additional areas of investigation while I tried to process the transformation of our legal strategy from reactive defense to proactive offense. Sarah, you need to understand that once we file these counterclaims, this case becomes much more serious for everyone involved. We're not just challenging their will contest. We're accusing them of fraud and conspiracy, which could have professional and potentially criminal consequences. The escalation was sobering, but the evidence seemed to demand aggressive action. Jake, they've already made this serious by lying about me in legal proceedings and trying to steal my inheritance through fraud. If there are consequences for their actions, that's justice, not escalation. David supported my position with his characteristic directness. They chose to fight dirty, so now they get to live with the consequences of that choice. Sarah didn't start this war, but she has every right to finish it. His militant attitude was becoming a source of strength for me, even as it continued to surprise me with its intensity. That afternoon, David and I returned to our systematic investigation of digital evidence, this time focusing on financial records and communication patterns that might reveal additional coordination between family members and their legal team. David's approach was methodical and professional, using analysis techniques that seemed far beyond anything I would expect from standard IT consulting work. Sarah, I found something interesting in the metadata of some of these documents, David said, pointing to timestamps and file modification records on his laptop screen. Several of the documents that Robert sent to your grandmother were actually created weeks before the dates on the emails. That suggests he was planning his legal advice well in advance of the conversations that supposedly prompted it. The technical analysis revealed layers of deception that wouldn't have been visible without sophisticated digital forensics. Robert hadn't just been providing conflicted legal advice, he had been preparing that advice before grandmother had even made her final decisions about it, suggesting that the entire advisory relationship had been manufactured to create a paper trail supporting their eventual legal strategy. This proves premeditation beyond any doubt, I said, studying the evidence David had uncovered. Robert was planning to challenge grandmother's will before she had even made her final decisions about it. He was positioning himself to provide advice that he could later attack in court proceedings. David continued his analysis, revealing
additional patterns in the digital evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture of coordinated deception. "Look at this," he said, showing me communication records between Patricia's personal email and Robert's professional account. They were coordinating legal strategy, while publicly pretending that Patricia was just a concerned daughter worried about her mother's well-being. The evidence was becoming overwhelming in its scope and detail, but I was also becoming concerned about David's obvious expertise in digital forensics and investigative techniques. David, I need to ask you directly, what kind of IT consulting work have you really been doing? This level of technical analysis and investigative capability seems way beyond normal consulting projects. David paused in his work and looked at me directly, and I could see him making another of those careful calculations about how much truth to reveal. "Sarah, I've been involved in projects that required understanding how investigations work and how digital evidence gets analyzed in legal proceedings," he said. "Some technical security work involves cooperation with law enforcement agencies and legal teams." His explanation still felt incomplete, but before I could press for more details, his phone buzzed with what appeared to be an urgent message. David glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted in a way that seemed almost professional, as if he was receiving instructions or updates related to ongoing work commitments. "I need to make a quick call," he said, stepping out of the room with his phone. Through the closed door, I could hear fragments of a conversation that sounded more formal and official than typical consulting discussions. Words like timeline, evidence, and coordination drifted through the door, along with what sounded like detailed reporting about our discoveries and legal strategy.
When David returned, he seemed energized in a new way, as if the phone call had provided information or authorization that changed his approach to our situation. "Sarah, I think we need to accelerate our investigation timeline," he said. "Based on some information I just received, Collins and Associates might be planning to file additional motions that could complicate our strategy if we don't act quickly." I studied his face, looking for clues about the source of his information and the nature of his obvious connections to people who knew about legal strategies and case timelines. "David, who were you talking to? How do you have access to information about Collins and Associates' legal planning?" My questions were becoming more direct as my suspicions about his background intensified. "I have contacts in the legal and technical communities who keep me informed about developments that might affect our situation," David replied. "It's important to stay ahead of their strategy if we want to maintain our advantages." His evasiveness was becoming more obvious, but I was torn between pressing for answers and appreciating the obvious benefits of his mysterious expertise. But I was also becoming aware that David's role in this investigation was more complex and professional than he had revealed. His knowledge, contacts, and technical capabilities suggested involvement in law enforcement or intelligence work that went beyond IT consulting. Tomorrow, I decided, I would demand complete honesty about his background and connections, regardless of how that information might change our relationship or our strategy. Emma Rodriguez's email arrived at 6:45 the next morning, marked urgent and containing a single line that made my hands tremble as I read it. "Meet me at Copper Canyon Cafe at 8. Come alone. I have something you need to see." Emma worked in the accounting department at Collins and Associates, someone I had never met personally, but whose name had appeared in several of the documents we had been analyzing. I showed the message to David, who immediately became alert in a way that seemed almost protective. "Sarah, this could be a setup. If Collins and Associates suspects we've been investigating them, they might be trying to gather information about our strategy or create some kind of trap." His concern seemed legitimate, but I sensed there was more to his wariness than simple caution. "David, she's asking to meet alone, which suggests she doesn't want to be seen talking to me by her employers. That sounds more like someone who wants to help than someone setting a trap." I was already reaching for my car keys, driven by intuition that this meeting could provide crucial information we needed. David insisted on driving me to the cafe, though he agreed to wait outside rather than accompanying me inside. "If this goes wrong, if it seems like any kind of setup, get out immediately and come straight back to the car." His protective intensity was touching, but it also reinforced my growing sense that he had experience with situations that required such precautions. Copper Canyon Cafe sat in a strip mall on the outskirts of Scottsdale, the kind of anonymous location where people could meet without attracting attention from colleagues or neighbors. Emma Rodriguez was already waiting when I arrived, a young woman in her late 20s with nervous energy and eyes that kept scanning the parking lot as if she expected to be followed. "Miss Mitchell, thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as I sat down across from her. "I wasn't sure you would, and I wasn't sure I should contact you, but what I've seen at the office is keeping me awake at night." Her obvious distress was compelling, and I found myself leaning forward to catch every word. Emma pulled out a manila envelope and placed it on the table between us, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "I work in billing and case management, so I see a lot of internal communications and financial records that most people don't have access to. What I've discovered about your case is wrong, Miss Mitchell. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong." The envelope contained photocopies of internal firm documents that revealed the true scope of Collins and Associates' strategy against me. Timesheets showing hundreds of billable hours devoted to family coordination meetings and narrative development sessions. Financial records indicating that Robert Collins was receiving a percentage of any successful recovery rather than standard hourly fees. Most damningly, email communications between partners discussing the need to manufacture additional evidence if their current accusations proved insufficient to win the case. "Emma, this is incredible evidence, but why are you bringing it to me? What's your connection to this case?" I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motivation, but I saw only genuine distress and moral conflict. "I've been working at Collins and Associates for 3 years, and I've seen them handle dozens of will contests," Emma replied.
Most of their cases involve legitimate concerns about undue influence or mental capacity. But your case is different, Miss Mitchell. From the beginning, the partners have been focused on winning rather than finding truth. They've been manufacturing evidence and coordinating witness testimony in ways that cross ethical and legal lines. The documents she had brought supported everything David and I had suspected, but with internal confirmation that made our theories irrefutable. How long have they been planning this approach? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer from our previous discoveries. According to the files I've seen, preliminary discussions began almost 8 months ago, Emma said. Mr. Collins brought the case to the firm long before your grandmother died, presenting it as a preventative strategy to protect family assets from an inheritance grab. But the internal documents make it clear that the real goal was always to challenge whatever inheritance decisions your grandmother made. The revelation that Robert had been planning legal action against me before grandmother's death was shocking in its callousness, but it also provided crucial evidence of premeditation that could destroy their entire case. Emma, are you willing to testify about what you've seen? Would you be willing to provide sworn statements about the firm's internal communications and strategy? Emma's expression became conflicted, and I could see her weighing the professional and personal risks of becoming a whistleblower against her former employer. Miss Mitchell, I want to help you, but I need protection from retaliation. Collins and Associates has a reputation for destroying people who cross them, and I can't afford to lose my job or have my career destroyed. The conversation was interrupted by David's sudden appearance at our table, his expression urgent and his voice carrying an authority I had never heard before. Sarah, we need to leave immediately. There are two men in a black sedan who have been circling the parking lot, and I just saw Robert Collins drive past twice in the last 10 minutes. His alertness and tactical awareness seemed professional rather than paranoid. Emiya immediately began gathering her documents, her nervousness spiking into visible fear. I knew this was a risk, she said. If they catch me talking to you, I'll be fired and probably sued for breach of confidentiality. Miss Mitchell, take the documents, but I can't be involved in this any further. David was already helping me organize the papers while scanning the cafe for exit routes and potential threats. Sarah, Emma's right about the risks she's facing, but she's also right about the value of this information. We need to get this evidence to Jake immediately and figure out how to protect her if she's willing to testify. As we prepared to leave separately, Emma grabbed my arm with surprising intensity. Miss Mitchell, there's one more thing you need to know. Collins and Associates isn't just planning to challenge your inheritance. They're planning to file criminal charges against you for elder abuse and financial exploitation. They've already been in contact with the district attorney's office about bringing felony charges. The revelation that Robert had been planning legal action against me before grandmother's death was shocking in its callousness, but it also provided crucial evidence of premeditation that could destroy their entire case. Emma, are you willing to testify about what you've seen? Would you be willing to provide sworn statements about the firm's internal communications and strategy? According to the internal communications I've seen, they're waiting for the civil case to establish a foundation of evidence before approaching prosecutors. But if the civil case starts going badly for them, they might accelerate the criminal referral as a way to pressure you into settling. David's expression had become grimly professional as he processed this information. Sarah, we need to leave now and get this information to Jake immediately. Emma, if you're willing to provide testimony, we can arrange protection and potentially immunity from any retaliation. His confident promise of protection seemed to come from experience with such arrangements. Emma nodded quickly, but remained visibly frightened. I'll think about testifying, but I need guarantees about protection from both professional and legal retaliation. Collins and Associates has a connections throughout the legal community that could make my life very difficult. Her concerns were obviously legitimate, but the evidence she had provided was too valuable to lose. As we left the cafe through separate exits, I realized that our investigation had uncovered not just a civil conspiracy, but potentially criminal behavior by a major law firm. The people I had trusted with my family's legal affairs were not just unethical, they were potentially criminals who were willing to destroy innocent people for financial gain. Part 4. The FDI badge. David drove with focused intensity that reminded me of law enforcement professionals I had seen in movies, checking mirrors constantly and taking an indirect route back to our house that seemed designed to detect or lose anyone who might be following us.
His transformation from supportive spouse to protective operative was becoming impossible to ignore, and I realized I could no longer avoid demanding answers about his true background and capabilities. David, stop the car, I said as we approached our neighborhood. Before we go any further, before we involve Jake in whatever this is becoming, I need you to tell me the truth about who you really are and what kind of work you actually do. My voice carried an authority that surprised even me, born from the realization that too much was at stake for continued evasion and half-truths. David pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed shopping center, his hands remaining on the steering wheel as he stared straight ahead for nearly a minute before speaking. Sarah, I've been trying to protect you from complications that could make your situation more dangerous. But you're right that you deserve to know the truth. His voice carried a weight I had never heard before, as if he was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'm not an IT consultant, David continued, turning to face me directly. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the Financial Crimes Unit in Phoenix. For the past 2 years, I've been working undercover on a long-term investigation into corruption and fraud within Arizona's legal community, specifically focusing on estate litigation firms that use unethical tactics to manipulate inheritance proceedings. The instant David said FBI, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a jarring clarity. His consistent interest in my family's legal affairs, his insistence on handling our financial records and security, his intense loyalty to keeping our marriage secure, they all took on new meaning.
Judgment about people. No, Sarah, absolutely not, David replied urgently. My assignment to Phoenix came after we were already married. When the Bureau learned about my wife's connection to a prominent estate planning family, they asked me to be alert for any information that might be relevant to their investigation. But our relationship was never part of any operation. His denial was emphatic, but I found myself questioning everything about our shared history. But you've been investigating my family? I asked, struggling to separate my personal feelings from the implications of what he was telling me. You've been gathering information about grandmother's estate and our family dynamics as part of your FBI work? The idea that our private family conversations had been potential intelligence gathering felt like another layer of betrayal. David shook his head firmly. I've been observing and documenting, but not investigating your family specifically. The Bureau's interest is in Collins & Associates and several other estate litigation firms that appear to be using fraudulent tactics to win cases and generate fees. Your family's lawsuit against you fell directly into that pattern, which is why I've been able to provide so much assistance with investigation and strategy. The explanation helped, but I was still struggling to process the magnitude of the deception about his identity and work. David, how could you not tell me something this fundamental about who you are? How could you let me go through this nightmare thinking I was married to an IT consultant when you're actually a federal agent with the expertise to help me? My anger was building alongside my confusion and hurt. Sarah, federal agents aren't supposed to involve their families in active investigations, and revealing my identity could have compromised both the operation and your safety, David replied. I've been walking a line between protecting you and maintaining operational security. But when your family hired Collins & Associates, that line disappeared. Your case became directly relevant to the Bureau's investigation. The coincidence seemed too convenient to be believable. David, are you telling me that it's just luck that my family happened to hire a law firm that's under federal investigation? That my husband just happened to be the agent assigned to investigate the very people who are now attacking me? My skepticism was growing as I tried to process the implications of such an extraordinary coincidence. It's not coincidence, Sarah. Collins & Associates specializes in high-value estate disputes involving prominent families. When Robert Collins married into your family 3 years ago, he immediately became a person of interest because of his firm's questionable practices and his potential access to wealthy clients through family connections. The Bureau has been monitoring him specifically because we suspected he would eventually use his marriage to Patricia as a source of cases.
The revelation that Robert had been under federal surveillance even before the current lawsuit added another layer of complexity to our situation. David, does this mean the FBI already has evidence of Robert's illegal activities? Can your investigation help prove that their lawsuit against me is fraudulent? The possibility that federal resources might be available to support my defense was both hopeful and overwhelming. The FBI can't interfere with ongoing civil litigation, but we can pursue criminal charges if we have evidence of federal crimes. Conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, all of these are federal offenses that carry serious prison sentences. If we can prove that Collins and Associates has been systematically frauding clients and manipulating legal proceedings, we can shut them down and send the principals to federal prison. The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, and his expression immediately became more focused and professional. Sarah, I need to call my supervisor immediately. Based on what Emma Rodriguez told us about criminal charges being planned against you, the Bureau may need to accelerate our timeline for taking action against Collins and Associates. David stepped out of the car to make his call, leaving me alone with the overwhelming reality that my husband was an FBI agent and my family's lawsuit was apparently part of a federal investigation into legal corruption. The revelation explained so much about David's capabilities and knowledge, but it also raised questions about the authenticity of our relationship that I wasn't ready to confront. When David returned to the car, his demeanor had shifted into what I now recognized as his professional mode. Sarah, my supervisor wants to meet with us immediately. The Bureau is prepared to move forward with arrests and seizures if we can provide sufficient evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Emma Rodriguez's willingness to cooperate could be the key to ending this entire operation. The drive to the FBI field office in downtown Phoenix felt surreal, as if I was entering a world that existed parallel to the ordinary reality I had known just weeks earlier. David's federal credentials gained us immediate access to secure areas of the building, and I found myself in a conference room surrounded by agents and
Prosecutors who spoke about my family's lawsuit as if it were part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Supervisory Special Agent Lisa Chen took the lead in briefing me about the Bureau's investigation into Collins and Associates. Ms. Mitchell, your husband has been working on this case for 2 years, but until recently, we lacked the internal evidence necessary to prove systematic fraud and conspiracy. The documents you've discovered, combined with Emma Rodriguez's testimony, provide exactly what we need to move forward with criminal charges. The scope of the federal investigation was far broader than I had imagined. Collins and Associates was suspected of defrauding dozens of families over several years, using insider information, manufactured evidence, and coordinated witness testimony to win cases they should have lost. Agent Chen, how many other families have been victimized by their fraud? I asked, beginning to understand that my situation was part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. We've identified at least 15 cases over the past 3 years where Collins and Associates appears to have used questionable tactics to challenge legitimate inheritance decisions, Agent Chen replied. The total financial impact exceeds $20 million in stolen inheritances and fraudulent legal fees. Your case represents the most egregious example because it involves direct family participation in the conspiracy. The revelation that other families had been victimized in similar ways was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it proved I wasn't paranoid or oversensitive about my family's behavior. Horrifying because it meant that Collins and Associates had been systematically destroying families and stealing inheritances for years without being stopped. What happens next? I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve complex legal proceedings that could take months or years to resolve. Can the FBI stop them from filing criminal charges against me? And can you prevent them from freezing my inheritance while they pursue their fraudulent lawsuit? Agent Chen exchanged glances with David before answering. Miss Mitchell, the Bureau is prepared to execute search warrants and make arrests as early as tomorrow morning.
But we need Emma Rodriguez to provide formal testimony, and we need you to consent to wearing a recording device during any future interactions with your family members or their legal representatives. The idea of recording conversations with Patricia, Margaret, and Thomas was emotionally difficult but strategically obvious. Agent Chen, if I agree to cooperate with the federal investigation, what protection can you provide against retaliation, and what guarantees can you make about stopping their civil and criminal cases against me? Full cooperation with our investigation will result in federal charges being filed against Collins and Associates and potentially against your family members who participated in the conspiracy, Agent Chen replied. Those criminal charges will effectively end their civil lawsuit because their credibility will be destroyed and their legal representation will be compromised. We can also provide witness protection services if you face any threats or intimidation. David leaned forward, his expression serious but supportive. Sarah, this is your decision, but I want you to understand that the Bureau's case doesn't depend entirely on your cooperation. Emma Rodriguez's evidence and the documents we've already gathered are sufficient to proceed with criminal charges. Your participation would strengthen the case, but you're not required to take personal risks to help the investigation. The choice felt both obvious and momentous. Cooperating with the FBI would likely end the nightmare my family had created, but it would also ensure that Patricia, Margaret, Thomas, and Robert faced serious criminal charges that could result in prison sentences. Agent Chen, if I cooperate fully, what kind of sentences are we talking about for the people involved in this conspiracy? Financial fraud and conspiracy charges typically carry sentences of 5 to 10 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines and restitution requirements. Given the scope and sophistication of this operation, we would seek maximum sentences for the primary defendants, especially Robert Collins, and any family members who knowingly participated in the fraud. The idea of my sister and aunt going to prison was difficult to contemplate, but I realized they had made their choices when they decided to lie about me in legal proceedings and attempt to steal my inheritance through fraud. Agent Chen, I'll cooperate fully with your investigation. What do you need me to do? The remainder of the afternoon was spent in detailed preparation for my role in the federal operation. Technical specialists fitted me with sophisticated recording equipment that would capture any conversations with family members or their legal representatives. Legal experts briefed me on what topics to pursue and what admissions to seek. Most importantly, David explained how he would provide backup and support during any recorded interactions. Sarah, remember that you're not alone in this, David said as we prepared to leave the FBI office. I'll be monitoring every conversation, and we'll have agents positioned nearby during any meetings. If anything goes wrong, if anyone threatens you, or if you feel unsafe, just use the signal phrase we discussed, and we'll intervene immediately. The drive home felt like traveling between two different worlds, the ordinary suburban reality where I had lived my entire adult life, and the federal investigation world where my family members were criminal suspects and my husband was an undercover agent. David, how do we rebuild our marriage after all these revelations? How do I trust someone who has been living a completely different identity for our entire relationship? David pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine before answering. Sarah, I know this feels like fundamental deception, but everything about our relationship, except my job title, has been completely authentic. I fell in love with you before I became an FBI agent. I married you because I wanted to spend my life with you. And I've been protecting you throughout this ordeal because you're the most important person in my world. His words were reassuring, but I knew it would take time to fully process the implications of his revelation and rebuild trust in our relationship. David, I need you to promise me complete honesty from now on. No more lies, no more half-truths, no more protecting me from complications. If we're going to stay married, I need to know exactly who you are and what you do. You have my word, Sarah. Complete honesty about everything, including the ongoing investigation and any future operations that might affect our lives.
I told you the truth earlier, but federal agents are trained to compartmentalize their work from their personal lives. This case forced me to choose between operational security and protecting my wife, and I chose protecting you. That evening, as we prepared for what would likely be the final phase of my family's legal assault, I realized that discovering David's true identity had transformed my understanding of everything that had happened over the past weeks. His expertise, his connections, his strategic thinking, all of it made sense now that I knew he was a federal agent rather than an IT consultant. More importantly, the federal investigation meant that my family's conspiracy would face consequences far beyond anything I could have achieved through civil litigation alone. They had chosen to involve themselves with criminals who were already under federal investigation, and tomorrow they would learn that their victims had access to resources and protection they had never imagined. The phone call came at 6:30 the next morning, Patricia's voice tight with barely controlled panic as she demanded an immediate family meeting at the estate. "Sarah, we need to talk right now. Something has happened that changes everything about our situation." Her urgency was obvious, but I couldn't tell whether she knew about the federal investigation or was reacting to some other development. David checked his recording equipment one final time before I left for what would be our family's final confrontation. "Remember, Sarah, your job is just to listen and record. Don't try to be clever or manipulative. Just let them talk and preserve whatever they say for the federal prosecutors." His professional demeanor was reassuring, but I could see genuine concern in his eyes about the personal cost of what we were about to do. The estate looked exactly the same as it had during my previous visits, but everything felt different now that I understood the true nature of the people waiting inside. Patricia, Margaret, and Thomas were seated in the living room where we had shared so many family gatherings, but their expressions carried a desperation I had never seen before. "Sarah, we just received information that Collins & Associates is under federal investigation for fraud and corruption," Patricia began without preamble. "Robert has been suspended from the firm pending an investigation, and there are rumors that arrests could happen at any time." Her composure was cracking as the reality of their situation became clear. I feigned surprise while my recording equipment captured every word. "Patricia, what does that mean for the lawsuit against me? If Robert's firm is under investigation, does that affect their representation in our case?" My questions were designed to elicit admissions about their coordination with Collins & Associates. Margaret leaned forward, her voice carrying a note of genuine fear. "Sarah, if the federal investigation uncovers our communications with Robert about your case, we could all be charged as conspirators. We need to find a way to resolve this situation before law enforcement gets more deeply involved." Her admission of coordination was exactly what the federal prosecutors needed to hear. Thomas, who had remained silent during previous confrontations, finally spoke with obvious distress. "Sarah, we made mistakes in how we handled concerns about your relationship with Mother. If we withdraw the lawsuit and agree to honor her will exactly as written, would you be willing to keep our family business private and avoid involving federal authorities?" The offer was too little and far too late, but I needed to keep them talking to gather additional evidence of their conspiracy. "Thomas, are you saying that you fabricated evidence against me? That the lawsuit was based on false accusations?" My direct questions prompted exactly the kind of admissions the FBI needed. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "Sarah, we were scared that Mother was making decisions that would leave us financially vulnerable. Robert convinced us that challenging the will was the only way to protect our family's security. We never intended to hurt you personally. We just wanted to ensure that everyone received fair treatment from Mother's estate." "But you did intend to lie about me in legal proceedings," I replied, pressing for more specific admissions. "You knowingly filed false accusations claiming I manipulated grandmother when you knew that wasn't true." The conversation was providing exactly the evidence Agent Chen had hoped to obtain. Margaret broke down completely, tears streaming as she spoke. "Sarah, we convinced ourselves that we were protecting Mother from undue influence, but the truth is, we were angry and jealous about how much she favored you. Robert told us we could challenge the will if we documented concerns about your behavior, so we started looking for evidence that could support our case." The full scope of their deception was finally being revealed in their own words, recorded for federal prosecutors who would use their admissions to pursue criminal charges. Thomas added the final piece of evidence we needed when he admitted that Robert had coached them on what to say in their witness statements and how to coordinate their testimony to create a compelling narrative of manipulation and undue influence.
"We know we made terrible mistakes," Patricia said as the conversation concluded. "We're prepared to withdraw the lawsuit completely and accept whatever consequences follow from our poor decisions. Sarah, we're your family, and we're asking for mercy and forgiveness for actions we deeply regret." I looked at the three people who had raised me, supported me, and claimed to love me for my entire life, and realized that mercy was no longer mine to give or withhold. Patricia, Margaret, Thomas, the time for family mercy ended when you decided to lie about me in legal proceedings and try to steal my inheritance through fraud. What happens next is up to federal prosecutors and federal judges. As I walked out of the estate for what I knew would be the final time, I could hear them beginning to argue among themselves about responsibility and blame, their unity finally fracturing under the pressure of impending criminal charges. The recording device captured every word of their desperate finger-pointing and mutual accusations, providing additional evidence of their conspiracy and their consciousness of guilt. David was waiting in the car with a team of FBI agents positioned throughout the neighborhood, ready to intervene if the family meeting had turned dangerous or if immediate arrests had become necessary. "How did it go?" he asked as I settled into the passenger seat. "Did they provide the admissions we hoped for?" "They confessed to everything," I replied, feeling simultaneously vindicated and heartbroken. "Conspiracy, fraud, perjury, coordination with Robert Collins. They admitted it all while trying to
Negotiate their way out of federal prosecution. The evidence we had gathered would ensure that justice was served, but it had come at the cost of destroying my family permanently. The arrests began at dawn the following morning. Coordinated raids that seized Collins and Associates' offices while simultaneously taking Robert Collins, Patricia, Margaret, and Thomas into federal custody. The news coverage was extensive, with reporters describing the unprecedented corruption scandal that had exposed systematic fraud within Arizona's estate litigation community. Emma Rodriguez's testimony proved crucial to the federal prosecution, her detailed knowledge of internal firm communications providing the evidence necessary to prove criminal conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt. The subsequent trials resulted in substantial prison sentences for all defendants, with Robert Collins receiving the maximum sentence of 12 years in federal prison for organizing and directing the conspiracy. 6 months later, as I stood in the renovated offices that had once housed Collins and Associates, now converted into a victim advocacy center funded by asset forfeiture proceeds from the criminal cases, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by this experience. The inheritance grandmother had left me was intact and secure, but more importantly, I had learned that family bonds based on love and respect were far more valuable than relationships built on obligation and shared DNA. David's revelation about his FBI career had initially shaken my faith in our marriage, but working together to expose the conspiracy had ultimately strengthened our relationship and deepened my appreciation for his commitment to both justice and protecting me. No more secrets, he had promised, and he had kept that promise through months of trials and testimony that had exposed every detail of our investigation to public scrutiny. The people who had claimed to love me while systematically betraying me were now serving prison sentences that reflected the seriousness of their crimes. But their punishment was less important to me than the knowledge that other families would be protected from similar victimization by the federal task force that had been established to investigate estate fraud throughout the Southwest. As I walked through the Victim Advocacy Center, reading thank you letters from families who had been helped by the services we provided, I realized that grandmother's final gift had been far more than financial inheritance. She had unwittingly set in motion events that exposed widespread corruption and created resources to help other families descend against similar attacks. The lemon tarts I had baked with such hope for family reconciliation seemed like artifacts from another lifetime, symbols of naivete that had been replaced by hard-won wisdom about the difference between genuine love and manipulative affection. The family I had mourned losing had never really existed except in my imagination, and the life I had built with David was based on truth and shared values rather than convenient deception. Standing in that renovated space, surrounded by evidence of justice served and families protected, I understood that the greatest inheritance anyone could receive was the knowledge that they had the strength to defend truth against lies, love against manipulation, and justice against corruption. The battle had been devastating, but victory had been complete.